Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're exploring a fascinating and honestly sometimes totally bizarre journey into how human culture has interpreted an entirely normal biological process, menstruation. For thousands of years, this fundamental human function has been surrounded by a really astonishing amount of fear, mystery, and misunderstanding. We're going to look at the stories we've told ourselves and how those very stories actually ended up shaping medical history.
Okay, let's dive into this. How exactly did a perfectly normal biological process inspire thousands of years of fear, magic, and mystery? Well, to understand that, we have to look at the incredibly profound duality of medical history that we're about to uncover. As you'll see, our ancestors looked at the human body and basically projected their own cultural anxieties, their rules, and their myths right onto it.
Part 1. Blood as both power and pollution. Across history, menstrual blood was viewed in deeply conflicting ways, sometimes even within the exact same culture. On one hand, it was categorized as a dangerous pollution. For many societies, it was seen as a literal curse, a monthly purge, or a source of deep, deep shame. But simultaneously, the exact same substance was considered a source of magical power. It was viewed as a natural cleansing process, a sign of fertility, and in some contexts, an incredibly potent healing remedy for things like skin conditions. It's wild to think about, right? The very same biological reality could be feared as a poison by some and revered as medicine by others.
Let's move to Part 2, Ancient Medical Guesses. So how did early doctors actually try to explain this? Well, back in 400 BCE, the Hippocratic tradition believed women's bodies were basically like sponges, softer, wetter, and absorbing extra fluid from food that naturally just had to be expelled each month. Then, a bit later in the 4th century BCE, Aristotle argued women were simply colder and wetter than men. He believed men provided the active shaping force in reproduction, while women provided the raw material. And since women couldn't turn blood into semen, well, they menstruated. He actually used this incorrect biology as proof of female inferiority. By the 2nd century CE, Galen wove this into his humoral theory, claiming women lived more sedentary indoor lives and needed to burn off excess humors through bleeding. They were constantly mixing anatomy up with their own societal assumptions.
And that brings us to a truly bizarre concept: the suffocation of the mother. The philosopher Plato actually described the womb as almost an independent creature living within the body. If it went too long without a pregnancy, he suggested, it would get restless and physically wander around the body. This was thought to cause choking, fainting, and emotional distress. What's actually happening here is that ancient doctors took very real symptoms, things like pelvic pain, cramping, or hormonal shifts, and just folded them into a complete mechanical fantasy anatomy that somehow survived for centuries.
Which brings us to Part 3, Folklore and the Moon.
While the doctors were busy making their educated guesses, everyday people developed their own terrifying ideas. Take the famous Roman author Pliny the Elder from the 1st century CE. He collected reports claiming that a menstruating woman could make seeds sterile, wither gardens, sour wine, dull steel, darken mirrors, kill bees, and even drive dogs mad if they tasted her blood. I mean, wow. This quote perfectly captures the absolute terror with which Roman folklore treated menstruation.
Now, what's really interesting here is the sheer scope and absurdity of these supernatural claims. Killing bees, souring wine, dulling steel. It leans into total agricultural fantasy. But while completely baseless, these writings mattered deeply. Pliny was spreading and preserving ideas that people were already willing to believe. It elevated a completely normal bodily function to a level of supernatural danger. Think about it. If a harvest failed or nature was unpredictable, this taboo gave people a convenient scapegoat. It made the unpredictable feel somewhat controllable. You know, many languages connect the words month and moon, leading to a very poetic lunar myth. It's that romantic idea that women, tides, blood, and moonlight all move in this beautiful, synchronized rhythm. It seems so obvious, doesn't it? But the medical reality tells a totally different story. Surprisingly, major ancient medical doctors like Hippocrates and Galen didn't actually insist on literal lunar control. They vastly preferred their own humoral theory over celestial influence. And modern science absolutely agrees with that skepticism, showing no strong, consistent synchronization between entire populations and lunar phases. It was a beautiful, powerful image, for sure, but just not a scientifically solid one.
Moving on to Part 4, Religion, Ritual, and Society.
Menstruation didn't just stay in the realm of medicine, though. It deeply shaped religious boundaries across the globe. For example, the Hebrew Bible focused on laws of niddah, which were all about ritual impurity and boundaries, leading to separation and ritual bathing.
Medieval Christianity took a much harsher tone, linking it to Eve's punishment and framing it as a heavy burden and a constant reminder of sin. But on the flip side, in some Hindu and Newar traditions of Nepal and India, a girl's first period, menarche, is actually a celebrated life transition. Seclusion is followed by purification, gifts, and public recognition. And this brilliantly illustrates the messier reality of how different cultures managed separation, stigma, and celebration right side by side.
Part 5. The Grain of Truth.
So, beneath the wandering wombs and the bee-killing folklore, there was actually some genuine, practical wisdom. Yes, the theories about crop curses and wandering organs were entirely false, but ancient people did successfully make real, accurate observations. They knew that healthy menstruation was a predictable rhythm. They knew a missing period could mean pregnancy. They also knew that a prolonged absence of menstruation, what modern medicine calls amenorrhea, was linked to real problems like illness, severe stress, or malnutrition. This proves that ancient medicine wasn't just pure fantasy. It was built on recognizing real patterns. They just happened to interpret those patterns through the wrong framework.
We can see this wild mix of genuine observation and dramatic imagination perfectly in their treatments. Herbal teas and steam baths were widely used to ease cramps, offering modest practical relief that actually made sense. Ritual bathing, while tied to strict religious rules, practically encouraged cleanliness long before modern sanitation even existed. But then, you have medieval advice from the Trotula text, which literally suggested burning a toad and wearing its ashes to control bleeding. No joke. This stark contrast highlights both the real desire to treat pain and the sheer medical desperation of the times.
So the crucial point is that these weren't just harmless campfire stories. These inherited beliefs had very tangible, sometimes deeply oppressive consequences. They shaped where women could go and what they were literally allowed to touch. They dictated whether someone felt able to speak openly about their pain. The heavy emphasis on expecting bleeding sometimes led families to completely overlook when something was actually seriously wrong. Ultimately, these beliefs turned a basic, everyday biological process into a massive issue of power and control. Which brings us to this incredibly powerful realization. People see the body through the beliefs they already carry. It is such an important takeaway. The history of menstruation isn't just a history about blood. Not at all. It's fundamentally about how humans project their cultural stories, their deep-seated fears, and their desperate need for control directly onto biology. The human body simply became a canvas for society's assumptions. And that leaves us with a final, provocative question. How much of what we believe about our bodies today is still shaped by the stories our culture tells us? Have we completely shaken off the folklore, or are we still projecting new myths onto our biology right now? It is absolutely something to seriously consider as we evaluate our own modern assumptions about health and wellness. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope this deep dive into the past gives you a brand new perspective on the present.